Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Erin Metz. I'm a Senior Accessibility Specialist with the Disability Equity Office. And presenting alongside me is Rachel Rotella, the Assistant Director of Human Resources and Operations with ECRT. We're also joined by Casey Lundgren, who is providing ASL interpretation today. So thank you all for joining us as we learn to better navigate the intersection of employee performance challenges and the interactive process. The University of Michigan remains committed to fostering an inclusive environment that emphasizes accessibility and the needs of individuals with disabilities. Today's workshop will guide you through the resources and supportive measures at UM. We'll discuss accommodations in the context of performance issues and offer recommendations backed by a case analysis example.
When employees find themselves in a situation where they are experiencing new or worsening medical conditions or exacerbation of symptoms of their disability, they have quite a few resources available. When an employee's conditions rise to the level where they are unable to work or need additional support in the form of time off, work connections, and HR units can help with short-term or long-term disability leave and with FMLA. The university provides diverse resources to support employees beyond leave options, including counseling services such as CAPS and FASCO. U of M aims to ensure every individual has access to the support they need to thrive in our community. HR partners are also an invaluable resource for supervisors navigating this sometimes tricky situation. And ombuds are also available for students, faculty, and staff. At the University of Michigan, workplace accommodations are facilitated through the Disability Equity Office for all faculty and staff at Ann Arbor, Flint, Dearborn campuses. We also facilitate requests for Michigan Medicine faculty. The Michigan Medicine HR Solutions Center facilitates all workplace accommodations requests for staff at Michigan Medicine. This ensures a consistent and supportive approach to addressing accommodation needs. Supervisors and HR reps can also connect with the Disability Equity Office or the Michigan Medicine HR Solutions Center for assistance in navigating the interactive process for facilitating accommodation requests outside of the DEO or Michigan Medicine HR Solutions Center processes.
Today, we won't spend a lot of time talking about accommodations, but we do have several resources and other workshops that will go into great detail about accommodations and the interactive process for those who would like to learn more. An accommodation involves modifying practices or environments to ensure equitable access for employees with disabilities. It's crucial to understand that accommodations are designed to support job performance without altering the essence of job responsibilities. One thing I often hear from supervisors who are engaging with employees who have accommodations but also have performance concerns is that they feel the employee is using their accommodation as an excuse to not do the work. Whether an employee has an accommodation or not, they must still meet the same performance, productivity, and job expectations of any other employee in the same role. Oftentimes, it's an accommodation that helps the employee to achieve these goals. To be eligible for accommodations, an employee must be qualified and able to perform their essential functions without or with accommodations. They must also have a condition that significantly limits one or more major life activities, meaning the condition rises to the level of a disability under the ADA. Many people have various medical conditions, but they do not substantially limit their ability to perform their essential job functions. This means that under this definition, those employees do not have a disability. One of the very first things DEO does when we receive a request for accommodation is make a disability determination. And we do so by collecting medical documentation and meeting with the employee to give them the opportunity to further explain how their condition is impacting their work. Accommodations are fundamental in providing employees with disabilities the same opportunities to succeed in their role as their peers. Accommodations remove barriers to allow individuals to perform essential job duties efficiently and effectively. Essential job functions are job duties an employee must perform, and these duties should be clearly identified in the employee's job description. It's the responsibility of supervisors and HR representatives to ensure that job descriptions are accurate and kept up to date for all employees. Accommodations are not about reducing expectations, but they involve providing the necessary tools to meet them. Accommodations are considered unreasonable if they impose an undue burden on the organization's operations, such as removing essential job functions, modifying performance standards, compromising safety, or fundamentally changing business operations.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about performance concerns. The three main roles or objectives for supervisors and HR partners when handling performance concerns are: apply performance standards consistently for all employees, focus on the employee's performance, not on their disability status or disability-related limitations or needs, and to provide clear and concise expectations for performance and productivity. You'll see this as a theme throughout the rest of this workshop. First things first, supervisors need to evaluate performance. When you do so, ensure that the same criteria are applied consistently for all employees, regardless of their disability status. For employees who already have accommodations, it's essential not to assume that the accommodation isn't working solely based on performance outcomes, as other factors may be at play. For example, it may take time for the employee to learn a new process, a new software program, or adjust to the accommodation. An accommodation should never be removed due to poor performance. Instead, a re-engagement in the interactive process is recommended to determine if there may be alternatives that provide better support and effectiveness. The workplace should establish clear and concise performance expectations and standards. These standards should be qualitative and based on the quality and characteristics of the work to gauge how well the employee is performing. They should also be quantitative, meaning that there are specific and measurable productivity standards. For more information on applying performance and conduct standards to employees with disabilities, you can visit this linked EEOC webpage. The EEOC states, employees work most effectively when they clearly understand what is expected of them and know what their performance will be measured against, a standard that is fair and applied even-handedly. Conduct standards should also be provided for all employees. These standards should be job-related and consistent with business necessity. They can include expectations about violence, threats, or damage to property. These standards can also include statements on misuse of technology, like sending inappropriate emails, also drug and alcohol usage in the workplace, and inappropriate behavior. Some common challenges supervisors report are in having difficulty holding employees accountable for their accommodations. It is important to remember, however, that the accommodation belongs to the employee and they can choose how, when, or if to use the accommodation that has been implemented for them. For example, if an employee has access to a software program to assist with concentration, they may decide to only use it when they feel an exacerbation of systems or symptoms warrant it. A manager should not consider this as a reason to remove the accommodation due to what appears to be a lack of use. Employees misusing accommodations, however, may be a different story. For example, if an employee can flex their schedule to work remotely on days when they experience worsening symptoms, but this seems only to align with days when a staff meeting takes place in the office, this may be a time to talk with the employee about what is happening and how it may be better addressed. Make sure the incidents and frequency are well documented, along with any conversation you have about the concern. Lack of clarity in performance or productivity expectations is one of the most common challenges I hear about from employees with accommodations. Supervisors should set very clear and concise guidelines for employee expectations, whether they have an accommodation or not. Another common challenge is regarding communication between the supervisor and employee. It can often be difficult to know what is appropriate to ask or to say to an employee with an accommodation. Our recommendation when you notice employees are still struggling after an accommodation has been implemented is to start the conversation with, "How can I help?" or "What can I do to support you?" Be open to what the employee has to say and be prepared to offer and implement alternative or additional accommodations to support the employee. From the beginning, it's critical to clearly communicate what is expected regarding both performance and productivity. This ensures that everyone knows what success looks like and helps prevent misunderstandings down the road. Be upfront about what will happen if these expectations are not met. Outlining consequences early creates transparency and can motivate employees to meet their goals. It's important to consistently apply these standards to all employees, including those with disabilities. However, remember that reasonable accommodations must be provided where appropriate. Consistency does not mean ignoring specific needs, but rather holding everyone to the same outcomes with the support they need. Check in with employees, especially if you notice they're having difficulty. Ask how you can support them or what resources might help. Always document any performance concerns as they arise. Good documentation helps track progress and provides clarity if further action is needed. It also helps ensure fairness and accountability. When you observe performance issues, communicate them directly and promptly to the employee. Share specific examples, avoid making assumptions, and give the opportunity for a two-way conversation. It's essential to recognize when an employee is disclosing a disability. Disclosures aren't always formal. Sometimes an employee may share information about a medical condition or just mention a need for support. Once a disability is disclosed, begin the interactive process. This means having an open and collaborative conversation, either directly with the employee or with DEO or Michigan Medicine HR Solution Center about the employee's needs and what accommodations might help. The aim is to find effective solutions that enable the employee to meet performance standards. It's important to keep discussions about job performance distinct from conversations about accommodation requests. Address performance issues based on job expectations, then address accommodation requests as a separate discussion about support. If an employee is on a performance improvement plan and requests accommodations, you may need to pause the PIP while going through the interactive process. This pause allows time to determine and implement appropriate support, ensuring that performance is fairly evaluated. Once accommodations have been agreed upon, put them in place promptly. After they are implemented, reevaluate the employee's performance with these supports in place. Performance should be assessed based on whether the accommodation has enabled the employee to meet expectations.
We're now going to provide answers to the three most common questions we receive when performance concerns meet accommodation requests. The first, can I expect disabled employees to perform equally as those without disabilities? Yes, employees with disabilities can be expected to meet the same performance and productivity standards as those without disabilities. This can also include complying with dress codes, meeting attendance and tardiness standards, and even eating at a workstation. But remember, an accommodation may be what is needed to assist the disabled employee in meeting those standards. Be sure you're providing clear and concise expectations for all of your employees when it comes to quality of their work. The second question, must I rescind discipline after an employee's disclosure of disability? No. Because accommodations are not retroactive, there's no requirement to rescind discipline after an employee discloses their disability. However, if it's the first instance the employee has stated that the disability is the cause for the need for discipline, the supervisor should provide information about how to request accommodations and provide clear and concise performance, productivity, and conduct standards. A supervisor cannot refuse to engage in the interactive process or refuse to provide accommodations as a result of any disciplinary action. Though it is the responsibility of the employee to request an accommodation, the supervisor should ensure the employee knows that not only may accommodations be available, but they should also know how to request them. Additionally, an employee with an accommodation is not privy to the withholding of disciplinary action up to and including termination that may be warranted due to poor performance or misconduct. And the third question, must I modify conduct rules for those with disabilities? No. Codes of conduct or policies regarding violations of applied conduct rules do not need to be modified for employees with disabilities. You may, however, need to provide accommodations that can enable the disabled employee to meet the conduct standards. For example, if an employee with a cognitive disability has difficulty observing operational rules regarding safety when they're in a loud and distracting environment, an accommodation that limits those distractions, like a private workspace or noise reducing headphones, may be necessary. Remember, any accommodation put in place to assist the employee is not retroactive. We often describe the convergence of performance with accommodations as a delicate balance. We must look at how we can support the employee while considering business necessity and operational need, while simultaneously thinking about the logistics of that support and considering while also being empathetic to the employee's situation. This is not always easy, but this is why it's important to utilize the support and resources that are available to navigate this process. And we're now going to go through a multi-part accommodation and performance example. Mark often arrives to work late. He doesn't routinely participate in team meetings, and he frequently misses deadlines. Mark's supervisor, Gina, gives Mark a written warning regarding his poor performance, in which Mark replies it's due to disability. Mark then requests accommodations related to his condition that causes chronic fatigue. But what should Gina do next? Though waiting until there was a performance concern to request an accommodation isn't ideal, the employer must still engage in the interactive process with the employee. Gina does not need to rescind the discipline or modify performance expectations. Mark and his unit engage in the interactive process where limitations and barriers are determined, essential job functions are identified, and accommodations are implemented. Mark's unit supports him by allowing for a flexible work schedule, use of note-taking software, and allowing for additional break periods. The flexible work schedule addresses the chronic fatigue Mark experiences and allows him to flex his schedule when he otherwise may have been late to work. After 3 months, Gina asks Mark how he feels about the effectiveness of the accommodations. Mark states that he feels he's doing well and the accommodations are helping. Gina, however, has documented that Mark is still routinely missing deadlines. What should Gina do next? Gina should have further conversations about the performance concerns, but she should not remove the accommodations, as more time may be needed for the accommodation to reach full effect. She should document specific examples of the deadlines that Mark has missed and also consider alternative or additional accommodations. For the sake of this example, let's say an additional accommodation of task management software is also implemented to assist Mark with meeting deadlines. It's now 6 months after engaging in the interactive process, and Mark is due for a yearly evaluation. Gina has kept very detailed documentation on Mark's performance related to engagement in team meetings and his ability to meet deadlines. Even with accommodations, Mark is not meeting performance expectations. Mark continues to state that his performance issues are related to his disability. So, what options does Gina have? Accommodations are not an excuse to be used for employees who are not performing well, even when it's related to a disability. An employee must still be able to perform the essential functions of their job with or without an accommodation. In this example, Mark has had accommodations in place for 6 months, but he's still not meeting performance standards. Though Gina wants to support Mark and be empathetic to his situation, Gina must consider operational and business need. Gina can continue to engage in the interactive process, all while holding Mark to the same performance expectations that all other employees are held to. Gina should complete the evaluation and document the performance concerns related to meeting engagement and missing deadlines. As a result, Mark could be placed on a PIP or have other appropriate employment actions taken.
Now we'll go through the list of questions that were submitted prior to this workshop. What are the advantages or disadvantages to tailoring a job description to fit an employee's skills and competencies? While modifying a job description to meet the skills and competencies of an employee would at first glance appear to be an approach of kindness and of least effort, it's one that is not recommended. Job descriptions are the best method of an organization to ensure that employees are meeting the requirements of each role and are commensurate with associate salaries. Job descriptions and salaries are benchmarked with internal and external data to meet recruiting and retention needs, as well as legal requirements, such as those that determine FLSA status, exempt and non-exempt status. Modifying job descriptions can easily change exemption status and materially affect an employee in the role. It can also place the organization at risk for Department of Labor audit and repercussions if we are not abiding by the FLSA.
Another question, how do we note the threshold for when an employee's absence due to their accommodation is becoming a burden to the department? I want to reiterate that an accommodation may not be reasonable if it poses an undue hardship to the department, meaning it's an action requiring significant difficulty or expense. And the only examples of undue hardship are cost, which is not likely to apply at the University of Michigan, as it's based on the entire university's resources and not just a singular department. The nature of the accommodation in relation to the resources and structure of the department's operation, or the impact on the operation and resources themselves. I also want to note that office morale, the ability to have water cooler conversations, or simply just wanting to see someone's face at the office do not equate to undue burden or hardship for any unit at the University of Michigan, and these ideas should not be used as a reason to deny a request for accommodation. When considering the impact on the operation, one thing employers should review is how providing the accommodation will impact how other employees perform their jobs or how the company conducts business. This review is concerned with determining whether the accommodation will be unduly disruptive to employees or operations. For instance, restructuring a job as an accommodation that amounts to coworkers being given significantly heavier workloads can be a factor to consider. However, coworkers complaining about an individual receiving an accommodation because of so-called special treatment would not be a factor that should be considered for undue hardship. This is because there's a direct impact on others' ability to complete tasks in the first situation, while the second is simply a negative reaction to the coworkers and the idea of an accommodation being provided. So to determine if the employee's absence is causing an undue hardship, the department should review essential job functions to determine if the absence is affecting the ability for the employee to perform the essential functions of the job. They should evaluate the duration and frequency of the absence. They can consider alternatives or adjustments to the accommodations that are already in place and evaluate the effectiveness and whether those alternatives may reduce the frequency or impact of the absence. If an accommodation is found to be unreasonable, the employer must consider a different or another accommodation that does not pose an undue hardship. And also document each of the steps you've taken to come to your decision.
Another question, how do I respond when an employee says their poor performance is due to a disability, but their requested accommodation couldn't be supported by our unit? Similar to the last question, if the interactive process determined that a requested accommodation was either unreasonable or the unit was unable to support because of undue hardship, the employer is required to consider alternative accommodations that may still provide some support. Remember, an accommodation's purpose is to assist the employee with performing the essential functions of the position. So first, we must consider if the performance concerns relate to an essential function. If they do not, meaning the function is marginal, an accommodation option may be to reassign the marginal task to a coworker and trade it for a substitute task the employee can perform. If the task is an essential function, we must consider alternatives that may still provide effective support to the employee. If there is no effective and reasonable accommodation to assist the employee, we then must consider if the employee is qualified for their position. Before we move on to the next question, let's refresh our memories on what constitutes undue hardship, remembering that what may be an undue hardship in one department may not be in another.
Another question that we've received was, my employee is burnt out before Friday, having already worked over 40 hours. I've tried to provide resources, but the employee says overworking is due to disability. How do I support them when they feel tired to the point of needing sick time? We must remember that accommodations are employee driven, and we cannot require an employee to seek assistance they may not want. So supervisors should pay attention to whether or not this employee is performing their essential job functions, or if the employee's absence on Fridays is posing a burden to unit operations. There may be other accommodations that could be helpful, like providing additional break periods, a modified work schedule, task and time management software programs, or a hybrid schedule. We should always ask the employee, how can I help you?
Another question, how do we address employees who say poor performance is due to accommodation needed when it has not been documented through appropriate channels? So we strongly recommend documenting any interactive process for an employee requesting accommodations. The employee is not required to submit their request for accommodation in writing. For example, if an employee says to their supervisor in a one-on-one meeting that they would really like to be able to start and end their shift 30 minutes early on Wednesdays, so they can go to a reoccurring doctor appointment each week, and the supervisor says, sure, no problem, we can do that. That is considered an accommodation request that has been approved by the supervisor. However, if the employee has no documentation of any accommodation having been requested, you can refer the employee to DEO or Michigan Medicine HR Solutions Center for Michigan Medicine staff, and we can engage in the interactive process.
How can I best support my employee with ADHD to better organize work, documentation, data, and schedules? We can start by engaging in the interactive process, meaning ask your employee what strategies they believe would help them the most. And then be ready to make reasonable accommodations, which may include providing task and time management software, using checklists, alarms, and timers, but also offering clear, consistent expectations regarding performance and productivity. Lastly, scheduling frequent check ins can help maintain ongoing communication and support. So, by taking these steps, you'll help to create a more productive and supportive work environment for your employee.
Last question, how do I start the discussion about accommodations without making assumptions? Emphasize collaboration and support your employee. Our goal is to support and encourage your success while addressing the problems we have identified. That's the best response you can provide.
Thank you all so much for joining us today as we've learned to better navigate this challenging situation. We hope that you have learned from us, and we hope to see you again soon.